Hey everyone, it's Andrew Lucky Chewy Lichtenberger for Octopi Poker. Today, I wanted to make a video, and this really goes out to all the people who are playing poker and want to improve, in particular ones who want to know how to study poker, but don't really know exactly how to go about this. So, I thought long and hard, and I came up with some creative ideas, which essentially distill poker strategy and poker theory down into 4 building blocks. And from there, I created 10 axioms with which you can use to consider all the different ideas that are significant when you're in-game playing and what should be going through your mind. And ideally, you figure out how to weight all these different variables appropriately so that you can make the best decision in any given moment. And if I may take a moment here, the thing that's so fascinating about poker is that the strategic ideas are so simple, but it's their relativity and weight in relationship to one another that makes the game so complex. So in many ways you could relate it to life, and that's a whole nother tangential topic. But let's go ahead and jump in. So these 4 building blocks are position, in particular your position relative to that of other people at the table, because that is often one of the largest considerations in range building, which we're going to get into. So 2 players playing in early position is significantly different than 2 players playing in late position, is significantly different than 1 player in early position and 1 player in late position. So that's the first one, position. The second is your stack size. And you can measure your stack size in big blinds. And you can also measure your stack size relative to the pot size. That's more of a post-flop idea. But what it allows you to do is understand how much your hand, and in a broader sense, your range, is worth relative to that of your opponents. And this is where we start to get into some more advanced ideas of thresholds and inflection points in strategy. But we're going to keep things more basic. We can get into that later. So the third idea is actually range construction. And your range is all of the hands that you could have in a particular instance, or all of the hands that your opponent could have. Now, you only get to play one of those hands, the actual cards you're dealt. But the idea of thinking about this meta of what your range can be informs all of your strategic decisions. Because if we only play our hand for its value, then our opponents will too easily be able to read us, and our strategy will become too obvious. So the fourth here, strategic principle or pillar of poker mastery, is strategy. And ranges and strategy are somewhat interchangeable, because in order to generate ranges, we have to understand, at least loosely, what kind of strategy we want to play. And in order to derive strategy, we need to at least understand roughly what a range looks like. So this is where it becomes a little bit paradoxical, but if we rely on the positions and the stack sizes, particularly stack sizes in relationship to pot, we're able to grasp largely what it is we need to think about when we're focused on range construction and strategic ideas. And those 2 things are really the cornerstone of playing excellent poker and poker mastery. So let's go ahead and jump into these 10 poker axioms that I created. The first is the closer you are to the button, the greater your positional advantage. That makes sense, right? The button is always in position. As such, the closer you are to the button, the more likely you are to be in position, and the higher in general your win rate will be. The second is that you must employ very different strategies when you're in versus out of position. And this is because your range has different preferences, whether you are playing in or out of position. Sometimes strategic ideas can be very similar in certain cases when you're in versus out of position, but that's not enough necessarily to rely on at all times. So the third is that the later your position, the wider your range. And that's because you have less players to get through. So if we're in early position, we have the whole table to get through. But if we're on the button, we only have the blinds. And this is a nice way to think about how easy or challenging it can be to win pots. And I always like to look at things kind of if we take them to their extreme. The reason that when you play heads up or 1 versus 1, you play so many hands is because there's only one player to get through. So this idea can be mapped quite nicely onto full ring games, where there's 6, 7, even 8 players at the table. The fourth is that your hand is concealed by your range. And I find that this is particularly helpful for a lot of newer players. And we touched on this idea earlier. But really what it comes down to is that your opponent doesn't know what your cards are, and you don't know what theirs are either. So given that, the best thing we can do is to approach things from this meta perspective, where we consider what are all the possible hands that a certain player could have. And where this really starts to get interesting, which we're not going to get too much into here other than mentioning it, is the idea of splitting ranges. So you have a consideration of all the hands that you could have or that your opponent could have, and then we break off different chunks of those bigger range and take different strategic actions with them. And what that does is it creates very specific composition of ranges, and it allows for certain strategies to manifest. So that might sound abstract, but in time, these ideas will make sense if you stick with it. The fifth is ranges become wider as stack sizes decrease. So the less chips that you have, relative to the blinds, relative to the size of the pot, the more hands you can play, because the cost of being wrong in some sense is significantly less. And it allows for, well, I'm jumping the gun here. Let's go ahead and wait for the axiom that describes the concept that I was trying to explain. So the sixth is that as stacks increase, so too does positional advantage. And it's important to take a moment here and describe the idea of effective stacks. So if you have 50 big blinds and your opponent has 100 big blinds, the effective stack is only 50 big blinds. Your opponent's additional 50 big blinds might have some strategic implications in the context of a tournament where playing hands and having an all-in, won't lead to the elimination of that player who has more chips, in this case, 100 big blinds. But strategically, often we want to know what the effective stack is because that allows us to understand how much can be risked in relationship to the pot. And a common idea is that we take things to the extreme to understand what the risk is when those scenarios do happen to occur. And what that allows us to do is understand more deeply what the risk mitigation strategies can be if we understand what hands in our range are too strong to want to play so aggressively early or too weak to not want to get all in. Not sure how much of this is too advanced, but I like to plant seeds for these more intricate concepts because in time they will start to make sense and they will bloom and form an overall strategic umbrella of understanding. So the seventh here is that as stacks go up, equity realization goes down, and as stacks go down, equity realization goes up. And this is what I almost jumped the gun on earlier. So the reason this is true is because if you think about an instance where you only have a single big blind, you're going to realize all of your equity. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you're always going to win, right? But it means that your hand and your range will get to see all 5 cards. So nothing is left out of the equation in terms of win rate. You're always going to be able to maximize the realization of your equity, meaning you always get to showdown and you don't have to put any more chips in. Now, this is not the case if stack sizes are much deeper. If stack sizes are a lot deeper, you're going to face big bets and raises across multiple betting streets, and you won't always be able to see showdown so effectively. So this really comes in handy when forming preflop ranges, because in order to understand how your preflop range looks, you have to know what the implications are of playing certain hands in certain scenarios. So the eighth is that deeper stacks allow for more creative and aggressive strategies, and that flows nicely from number 7, right? The deeper the stacks are, the more you can make these large bets and raises. And making these large bets and raises allows you to increase your equity realization. And this is somewhat of an art form to me. I've always felt that poker has this creative element. And being able to understand, again, what the implications are of certain action sequences, both for your range and your opponent's range, is that sort of true artistic component to poker. So, the ninth is that proper strategies are predicated on identifying ranges and accurately weighting their subsets. So, what does that mean? Well, we talked about this earlier. The idea of having a range and then breaking it down into certain subsets of that range tell you specifically what types of hands compose your opponent's range. So now it's not only about figuring out what kind of hands are in there, it's figuring out what those hands actually mean. So a common idea here might be that we end up on the river, and let's say a third heart comes and now there's a possible flush. What we would want to do in order to strategically identify what makes the most sense is figure out how often we have a flush and how often our opponent has a flush. And at the top end of ranges, the strongest hands that either player can have, being able to accurately identify what sorts of likelihood there is for the relative weight of one player having a flush versus another, one player having a straight versus another, a set, two pair, etc. That really is one of the largest components of dictating bet sizing and raise sizing. Because if I have a flush 4 times as often as you do, I'm probably going to be able to bet really big because I get to exploit that aspect of my range. And the last here is that precise strategies are a synthesis of position, stacks, and ranges. And that's really all there is to it. Now, what we've done at Octopi Poker is created a social and collaborative learning system for you to be able to come and take your hand histories, collaborate with people in our community, bring your friends, and essentially learn together and understand better what poker is, what makes up these different strategic ideas. So, with that said, we hope that you'll come and join us, and we wish you all the best at the tables. Take care. Peace.